This is Block 10, the 1960s, Section 2, Black Power, with this section beginning Ghetto Riots. We've touched on it before, but discriminatory housing practices in most American cities led to overcrowding in black neighborhoods. So you take kind of that's the first ingredient, overcrowding. And then you take the increasing radicalism of the civil rights movement and of black leadership. And that's kind of the second ingredient, that that this more strident militant point of view makes the message of Martin Luther King less popular. And there's a baby boom in black America, putting lots of teenagers on the streets by the late 1960s. And those three things, plus the summer heat, kind of combined to create this combustion, this explosion of violence in American inner cities in the late 1960s. 1966, but in 1967 it really gets going. Riots explode in dozens of American cities. Newark, New Jersey, had bloody riots that took 25 lives, mostly black. Detroit, federal troops had to be called in. Los Angeles, rioters, torched their own neighborhoods, chanting "Burn, baby, burn," and then attacked police officers who were trying to keep the peace, and even attacked firefighters trying to put out the fires, in their own homes and businesses. Radical whites, again celebrated and encouraged these events as the beginnings of uprisings that would take down, white racist, sexist, homophobic, capitalistic, imperialist America, KKK, with the K's instead of the C. And, black radicals were egged on by white radicals, and then white radicals were inspired by black radicals to be violent themselves. But who this really hurt in the end, of course, was the black communities themselves, where businesses were destroyed, homes were destroyed. It caused insurance prices to go up, made it harder to start businesses. It's an expression of anger, and we can understand, I think, where that anger comes from. But, the fact that, and they were called long, hot summers, the name given to this epidemic of riots. But it made white America kind of, white America, liberal opinion in the United States, kind of centrist American opinion in the United States, until this happened, had been entirely pro-equality, that most Americans, were behind the message of Martin Luther King. But, the white reaction to these ghetto riots is bafflement. It made no sense to white America. They said that black people have achieved, segregation is gone. We passed the civil rights movement. Black people are voting. We've invented this thing called affirmative action. We're bringing black people into mainstream American society. That to them it doesn't make one bit of sense. So in reaction to these riots and this unrest in the inner cities, white, politicians begin, appealing to what what was called law and order. That, politicians who said, if you elect me, I'll, bring law and order back to American towns and cities. Before this, Americans would, felt safe in their cities, in their homes, and that was changing very, very quickly. So political appeals to law and order. Richard Nixon, is the first, national Republican to do this. Richard Nixon says, a vote for Nixon is a vote for law and order. It's a reaction, again, not against integration in the South. No, it's a reaction against these urban riots in the North. That people, when Nixon says law and order, that's what people are thinking. And it's not just black people, it's the white radicals as well. Taking over college campuses, taking over, college administration offices, burning their draft cards. That all of this rejection of authority is what Richard Nixon kind of tapped into when he ran on a policy of law and order in the United States. The long, hot summers also finished off the process of white flight that, had begun after World War II, and that's why today, by and large, the only white people that live in inner cities, are of two types. One is, new white ethnics, white immigrants, Poles, Portuguese, people from the Balkans, and really, really rich whites that have come and gentrified, old neighborhoods in the city. But your traditional white ethnics that had, been on their way out, since the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, the urban riots of the 1960s got the rest of them the hell out of Dodge, and they moved off to the suburbs. One of the things that makes Elizabeth sort of unique is Elizabeth was the only large city in New Jersey not to have race riots. And that's why, to a very large extent, Elizabeth, although Elizabeth is obviously an urban area, Elizabeth retains much more of its middle-class history than cities like Newark and Irvington and Hillside. And I think you guys are very well aware of that Elizabeth is a little bit different from Newark and Irvington and Hillside. And a lot of that reason is that there were no riots in Elizabeth, that the white flight never really happened entirely in Elizabeth like it did in a lot of other communities. And there never was these riots that created this atmosphere of even more distrust than there already was. But this was a fact of life in the late 60s. Every summer, you know, that many American cities would burn up in riots. And, you know, black Americans were angry at the slowness of economic integration. They were angry at the slowness of political success. And white Americans saw these riots and kind of said, well, what are you thinking? Like, now that you finally achieved equality, you go and do this? And it turned a lot of white Americans off to racial issues that white Americans had been all about, you know, through the 50s and 60s and early 60s.